The number of times I have said vampire, trying to say werewolves and vampires in this video is ridiculous. Hey y'all, welcome back to another doll movie review. Today we are going to be taking a look at Monster High Fright On. This is the second and final 2D animated movie for Monster High, and I went in with very low expectations. If you guys have seen the reviews that I did on the Monster High webisodes and then also the first movie, New Ghoul at School, you know that I didn't like those very much, and so I kind of went in afraid that I was going to get the same vibe from Fright On. Thankfully, that is not the case. I actually have positive things to say about this movie today, which, like, is kind of the bare minimum, but also given my previous reviews, is very exciting. I do still have some negative things to talk about, but at the very least, this review is going to be a bit more balanced, which is cool. But before I can get into that, I do have to give the usual disclaimers. The first is, as always, this is just my opinion, so if I have problems with the movie and you really like those aspects, it's not anything personal, it's just that we have a difference of opinion. And then just like with my other movie reviews or like webisode reviews, I will be using screenshots rather than clips because I am terrified to use clips because I don't know how to be safe in the copyright system here on YouTube. So just to kind of cover myself, cover my bases, I just use screenshots, but hopefully those will get across kind of the moments that I am talking about. I also will be talking very openly about the plot, so if you haven't seen this movie, this is going to be the only sort of like spoiler warning that you are going to receive. And then lastly, if you guys do find yourself enjoying the video, if you could give it a like, that's very helpful to me. And if you're new here and you like what you see, definitely subscribe so you can see more. But with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about Monster High Fright On. There are a lot of really small things about this movie that I enjoyed that didn't really fit into any bigger kind of subsection, so I thought I'd start off this review with just all the little bits and pieces that I really did enjoy. The first one is that right off the bat you can tell that this movie had a much higher budget and that it went towards the animation department. I understand why New Ghoul at School didn't have a very high budget given that it was the first Monster High movie, so like you can't necessarily expect incredible stuff right off the bat, but it was really awesome to see that literally from the intro sequence of Fright On, the animation was so much more on point. It was smoother and more detailed. Both the characters and the environment felt much more alive. And so just from a visual standpoint, this movie was so much better than its predecessor. Then there was Abby, who was undoubtedly my favorite character this movie. I was so excited every single time she was on screen. She's one of the very few characters who maintains her cool and is like calm and composed no matter what is happening around her, and she's also just so funny. At one point in the movie, when the werewolves and vampires are arriving at Monster High, she holds up a very simple welcome sign and says that she didn't want to make it too flowery, which I thought was funny. And then the other one that got me, that literally made me laugh out loud, was when Abby compared Draculaura and Howleen to baby yaks at mealtime and then bleated. It was just so deadpan and so funny, and the delivery was amazing. So genuinely every time Abby was on screen, I was having a good time. So I definitely had to kind of give her a note here in the positive section. And then lastly, for the more minor positives, I wanted to talk about what I guess you would call a product placement or like a slightly more advertisement-like section. At one point in the movie, there's this scene where a bunch of the different ghouls are waking up in their bedrooms and they're all dressed in their Dead Tired outfits, which obviously is meant to kind of advertise the Dead Tired dolls. Now, if you watched my webisodes review, you'll know that the webisodes also had like whole episodes like this that were clearly dedicated towards advertising dolls, but it was very obvious and really jarring to watch because it was literally just for the advertisement. Now, I will say that the pajama sequence here wasn't 100% necessary to this movie, but I do feel like its inclusion felt a lot more natural than other kind of advertisement sections that we saw in the webisodes. There also was some really interesting work with transitions and the like vocal lines that were being delivered in this section to make it interesting on its own and kind of take away from the fact that it was an advertisement. Given that Monster High media in general is going to be made to try to get people interested in the franchise and therefore try to get them to buy the dolls, I understand why there had to be a product placement, and I do think that Fright On managed to do it in a very subtle way compared to some other examples that we've seen, and it really didn't jump out at me as being aggressively an advertisement for the dolls, which is really the least that I can say for a product placement. So weirdly enough, that is something that I thought was a big positive for this movie. But that is going to be all of the like little things that I liked, so let's go ahead and move on to the big thing that I thought was really good about Fright On. On the surface, Fright On handles the typical message that Monster High tries to give and that the whole brand is kind of based on, which is basically just that it's okay to be different and different can be good and people who are different can get along. And that is a really lovely message in general, but I do think that this movie took it to a deeper level, which I really, really appreciated. The major conflict in this movie is the feud between vampires and werewolves, and the whole movie kind of centers around them learning to get along. But beyond the basic just be kind to others message, I did get a really big sense of kind of a minority allegory. Specifically, I think that this conflict between the vampires and werewolves reads as like a race allegory, but I do think it could also be applied to other minorities such as the queer community. During the course of the movie, the vampires are literally described as monster aristocracy, and whenever the werewolves are talking about why they don't like vampires, they will mention unnamed atrocities that have been committed in the past. Like, they'll say that vampires have done terrible things to their kind, but they don't go into any detail. And then the only time that any detail really is given is that the werewolves will kind of complain that vampires use their powers to gain skill or status that they haven't necessarily earned. Meanwhile, when the vampires are describing the werewolves negatively, they'll describe them as dumb, dirty, disease-ridden, or kind of meatheads in the sense that, like, they're itching for a physical altercation, but they don't really have any wit to back it up. Both vampires and werewolves clearly have problems with each other, but the way that those problems are described is vastly different. And when I saw this, I immediately made the connection that the negative things about vampires tend to be either not described at all, or they center around an abuse of power, whereas the negative things about the werewolves, first of all, there's a lot more of them, but second of all, they tend to center around the werewolves being lesser than the vampires and being disgusting for it. All of the things used as insults towards the werewolves reminded me of negative stereotypes that would be directed at people of color, indigenous people, queer folks, and basically any other minority in today's day and age. I found it really interesting to see this represented, and I do really appreciate that Monster High tried to put it in here because it is a very difficult subject, but I do think it's a very important one. I feel like young kids watching this movie will get that generic, surface-level, be kind message that is also very important, but it's not too heavy, and I think that that's a good takeaway for younger people watching. But I also think that teenagers watching this movie for the first time might be able to see kind of that deeper message here and take a little bit more away from it. My only critique when it comes to this allegory is that in the movie Fright On, the vampires and werewolves are kind of portrayed as being equally at fault in the feud, whereas when you take a look at the real-life issues that I kind of see mirrored within the movie, you definitely wouldn't say that, for example, Romani people are equally at fault with those who perpetrate negative stereotypes about them and their lifestyle. Or you wouldn't say that Native American peoples are equally at fault with the white settlers that drove them from their homes. I do think that the movie tries to rectify this at least a little bit because it does portray the vampires as more openly villainous. For example, Gory, one of the main vampires and like kind of one of the leaders of the vampire faction, doesn't really have any redeeming qualities. There's never a scene where, like, you think that she's being nice or she's kind of humanized. And then on the flip side, Romulus, who is a main character within the werewolf faction, has better moments. When he first finds out that Claude and Dracula are a couple, he's definitely startled that Claude is dating a vampire, but at the outset he seems more confused than angry. He does go towards being angry after kind of being manipulated by Hellscream, but his initial reaction is less violent and more just cautious. There are also other points during the movie where Romulus will kind of try to keep the peace between vampires and werewolves and urge the werewolves to kind of stand down and not fight. And so in general, I think that he seems like more of a peaceful person and more of a person that you can sympathize with a little bit more when compared to the vampire characters that we see in this movie. So I do think that Monster High at least tried to make the werewolves seem a lot more sympathetic than the vampires, which at least combats that issue with the allegory a little bit. So overall, it might not be like a perfect representation of what is, again, a difficult and complicated issue, but I do appreciate that Monster High at least tried to tackle something like this. So that is the conclusion of all the stuff that I did like about this movie. So now we're going to move into more familiar territory and start talking about the things that I didn't like as much. There are two subplots within this movie, one of which I think was handled much better than the other one. So we're going to start off with the better one, which is the one that concerns Howleen. Howleen's story within Fright On is basically that she's kind of like trying to navigate the world and doesn't quite have a place at Monster High yet, and then Hellscream takes advantage of this, kind of manipulates her into feeling negatively towards the vampires, and so therefore uses her to deepen the feud between the werewolves and the vampires. It's not a terrible plotline at all, and I do really appreciate it that it ties into the main plot, because I just think it makes it more relevant as a subplot. Like, Howleen has her own stuff going on, but it all ties together, and I just think that it's done very well in that regard. But there are two things that gave me pause. The first is that this feels like it might be similar to 13 Wishes. I don't know for sure, because I haven't seen 13 Wishes, and I didn't want to look it up to confirm my suspicions, because I do plan on watching 13 Wishes and doing a review video like this for that movie, so like I want that review to be as untainted as possible. But I thought that 13 Wishes also had a plotline where Howleen was kind of misguided or like led along a bad path by someone else and therefore causes trouble for others. I could be wrong, and if I am, just completely disregard this. But if I'm right, I do think it's weird that Monster High would give Howleen basically the same plotline twice. I think it would be weird enough if they just used the same plotline twice, but to give it to the same character just felt really strange. Like, I don't have any particularly strong feelings for Howleen, but I do feel like her character probably deserves to be more than just ends up getting used by others and makes things bad and then feels guilty for it. You know, like, I feel like she probably should get something other than that. Again, I could be completely wrong, so like if that's not how 13 Wishes goes, I'm wrong. But if it is, it was just something I noticed that was a little bit strange. The second thing that I didn't like about Howleen's subplot is that what I described to you as her subplot is actually only the second half. During the first half of the movie, before Hellscream comes into play, the entirety of Howleen's character can be boiled down to she borrows Claudine's things without asking, and Claudine is mad at her for it. I want to say that the idea in including this was to try to establish that Howleen is trying to find her own identity and is kind of struggling with that. But I just don't think that it was executed super well. Instead of feeling like a complex character who has her own thoughts and feelings, she just comes off as a one-note younger sister kind of archetype. And honestly, everything she does in the first half of the movie feels like it could have been cut out entirely to give more screen time to the interesting things. I do think that Howleen's character, for the role that she plays in the second half of the movie, could have benefited from being built up more in the first half. Like, I think that it would have been good to establish that she is having trouble kind of separating herself from her siblings who are already at Monster High and finding her own identity. I just think that the way they went about it wasn't super well done. The second subplot is the rivalry between Cleo and Gory. Gory, from the second that she sets foot in Monster High, is kind of vying for Cleo's spot as top dog at the school. So in addition to kind of being a part of the vampire versus werewolves thing, Gory has her own separate issue with Cleo. I want to say that this was supposed to make Gory seem more villainous, kind of tying back to what I said before about the vampires being portrayed as more bad than the werewolves. I think that was the idea with this, but honestly, this is a lot harder to pin down the reasoning for this subplot than Howleen's plot was. Unlike with Howleen, the Cleo and Gory thing doesn't really tie in at all to the main subplot, despite Gory being a vampire. It's just like its own completely separate bubble. And also, calling it a subplot in general feels a bit generous, just because there's no structure whatsoever. Again, comparing it to Howleen's subplot, Howleen starts off being kind of confused. She is misguided and manipulated by Hellscream, and she does some questionable things. And then by the end of the movie, she's talked to Draculaura and kind of realized that her actions weren't really coming from her own thoughts, and everybody is friends again. So, like, Howleen has this whole arc. But with Cleo and Gory, the whole movie, they're just kind of competing with each other, and Cleo is trying to do everything Gory does, but better. And then at the end of the movie, there's this weird sequence where they kind of smile at each other as though they've made up. But there's no sequence where they made up. Like, there's nothing in between we're fighting and now everything's okay. Everything's okay at the end because the movie needed a happy ending in, I guess, every single regard. Like, they couldn't leave the whole Cleo and Gory thing open-ended. But there's just absolutely no plot in between these 2 points, and it feels incredibly pointless. This subplot absolutely could have been cut entirely from the movie, and nothing would have been affected. Like I said, it doesn't tie in any concrete way to the main plot, so it doesn't add anything there. And without having a satisfying resolution or a satisfying, like, middle part to the plot, I just don't think that it was necessary at all, and I honestly think this subplot was one of the weakest parts of Fright On. I do understand that in general, a lot of media where kids or teens are the main characters, the problems that they're facing are problems that adults realistically should be dealing with, but like the adults aren't the main characters, so the kids end up having to deal with that. I get that that's a pretty normal thing, so maybe this isn't the most valid thing for me to complain about, but I still am going to complain about it because the adults in this movie should have been more present, were not present, and then when they were present, they were terrible. I'm going to use Artemis Fowl as an example, which might be a bad idea because I don't know how many of you will know what I'm talking about, but I do think that that book series is a really good way to give an example of the young protagonist thing done well. At the beginning of the series, Artemis Fowl, the title character, is a 12-year-old boy genius who comes into contact with the secret world of fairies. Throughout the course of the series, he saves the fairy race, the human race, and the entire Earth multiple times over. He does also start off the series as a villain, but that's besides the point for what I'm trying to illustrate here. The point is that Artemis is a young boy who by no means should be fighting off adult evil masterminds or saving the world or facing death or anything like that. Like, he's a kid. He should not be having to do that. However, he isn't just young for the sake of being young. As a character, Artemis Fowl would be fundamentally different if he wasn't young. Like, he needs to be young to be the character that he is. As a boy genius, he has trouble connecting with his peers, and even though he doesn't like to admit it, he experiences a little bit of loneliness because he is so much smarter than those around him, and he has a hard time connecting with people his own age. He also has to deal with the fact that he has had a lot of burden placed on him at a young age, partially due to other circumstances and partially because of his intelligence. A lot of plot points within the series also hinge on people underestimating Artemis because of his age, and in the first book, when he first makes contact with the fairy world, he even makes the remark that he's the perfect age to be doing so because he's old enough to use his brain power, but young enough to still believe in fairies. So yeah, Artemis is a 12-year-old boy in the series because the book had a tween audience that it was catering to, but also the plot wouldn't function the same at all if Artemis was any other age. All that to say that there is a good way to explain why young characters are forced to deal with very adult issues in media, and I just don't think that Fright On had that same level of control in that regard. When the vampire and werewolf schools merge into Monster High, Bloodgood decides to appoint the Fear Leading Squad as the welcoming committee and kind of puts the responsibility on them to ease the tension as these two feuding schools come together. However, the feud between werewolves and vampires has literally been going on for centuries at this point, and to me that's an overwhelming amount of pressure to be putting on a group of teenagers, no matter how smart or intelligent or capable they are. That's a lot of pressure to be putting on them, and personally I feel like adults should definitely be taking point on trying to resolve a hatred that is hundreds of years in the making. And yeah, I understand that Frankie, Claudine, Draculaura, and the others are the main characters, so of course they have to be involved. But that's the only reason they're involved, and that's why it bothers me a little bit. With Artemis Fowl, the story would be fundamentally changed if it was written with him as an 18-year-old instead of a 12-year-old. Whereas with Fright On, there literally would be no difference in the plot if Claudine was 21 instead of 16 and it was Monster University instead of Monster High. I get that you can't change the entire brand and the franchise for a movie plot, but I hope you get what I'm saying here. It's just really hard to watch teenagers be forced to deal with these issues that adults should be tackling. And then even when the adults are there, like I said, they're literally less than useless. Towards the end of the movie, when Draculaura, Abby, Howleen, and Bloodgood are first trapped by Hellscream and then being chased by monsters through the catacombs, Bloodgood constantly looks to her students for instruction and for protection and for what to do next. Bloodgood is the only adult there, and she's also in a position of power above these students because she's literally their headmistress. So by all means, she should be the one making the plans and trying to figure out what to do next and reassuring her students that everything is going to be okay. At the absolute least, she should have the good graces to not openly be looking to her students for protection. But that's exactly what she does. And again, I do get that it's for the plot that Abby is so much more capable in this situation than Bloodgood. But to me, for the plot just isn't enough of a reason. At the very least, I would have liked some acknowledgement that the adults aren't doing enough. I'm gonna give you guys another example, because I'm kind of on a tangent now. So I want to talk about My Hero Academia. To give a very simplified version of the plot, it follows the main character, Deku, as he gets accepted into a high school that trains its students to become superheroes when they, come of age and become adults and need a job. However, instead of getting to have a relatively normal high school life, everything kind of blows up in his face because a group of supervillains starts a war because they want a power that Deku has inherited. Deku has to be involved because he's the only one with this power. There's no one else who has it, so therefore no one else can fight this fight for him, and his classmates are kind of pulled along and pulled in by association. Furthermore, the show doesn't shy away from acknowledging the fact that all of the adults within it actively failed these children. Like, the adults know that they failed these children and that it's horrible that these kids are being forced to fight in a war because the adults around them literally can't do it without them. Part of what makes it a good show is that there's a layer of tragedy added by the fact that the adults know they failed these kids, and the audience knows that these kids shouldn't have to be in these situations because they're way too young to be dealing with this, but they have no choice. And so that's a part of the show. It's not just this unexplainable thing where, oh, they're kids because high school shows are popular. There's a reason for it, and it adds to the themes in the show. So I bring that example up because I would have loved for Fright On to do even like a shadow of the work in that area that My Hero did. Even just at the beginning of the movie, having the Fear Squad say that they wish some of the teachers were more active in helping them be part of the welcoming committee would have kind of acknowledged that the teachers are putting a lot more responsibility on them than I personally think is appropriate. I know I'm probably asking a lot from this movie, but it's just something that I noticed and that I wanted to talk about, and honestly, the fact that I'm complaining on this kind of deep a level is a good thing to me. When I like things, I get kind of more analytical, and the fact that Fright On even had something that I could analyze like this was very exciting to me. So even though I am complaining, it's kind of a good thing. When it comes to the villains of this movie, they aren't the worst, but they definitely aren't the best. They're just kind of okay. Out of the two of them, I think that Crabgrass is by far the worst villain, so just like with the subplot section, we're going to talk about the better one first and talk about Van Helscream. Van Helscream is a human who has devoted his life to studying monsterkind and their artifacts. He is kind of portrayed as someone who is thought to be using this knowledge to bridge the gap in understanding between monsters and humans, but in actuality he dislikes and distrusts monsters and is trying to kind of play the know your enemy card, and he wants to learn as much as he can about them to protect humans from them. When the vampires and werewolves start getting along, Crabgrass calls Hellscream in to prevent them from completely setting aside their differences. He then stirs up more and more trouble with the goal of getting these school administrators to realize that the idea of different monster kinds being able to coexist in unity is simply impossible. Hellscream says that his motivation for doing this is that if monsters are too busy fighting themselves, they won't be able to team up and become a threat to humankind. His logic does make enough sense to where I do think that it's a reasonable motivation for his villainous action. My main problem with Hellscream is just that I kind of wish he were more present throughout the entirety of the movie. During the first half of the movie, when everything is kind of going more smoothly, he's not mentioned at all, and then suddenly in the second half of the movie, he's the big bad. I think that it would have been a lot better if Bloodgood brought in Hellscream from the beginning to aid the Fear Squad and like kind of head up the welcoming committee, and so the movie starts off with you thinking that he's helping, and then by the end you realize that he has actually been sowing the seeds of discontent the whole time. I just think that would have been a more effective way to use his character, because in the second half he's really good, but he's just not present at all in the first half, and so I think having more of a setup would have been beneficial for him. When it comes to Crabgrass, she is a much, much weaker antagonist. As I just said, and kind of what I think would have been a better version of the villain plotline here, she doesn't even exist. But as the movie is actually written, Crabgrass is a surprise villain who, like I said, is the one to call in Hellscream and kind of start off things going badly. My first issue with this is that Crabgrass is a surprise villain, and like there's this whole reveal that she was actually a bad guy all along, but there's no lead up to it whatsoever. At the beginning of the movie, she is surprised to find out that the different monster schools are going to be merging, but she doesn't seem angry about it, she just seems a little bit shocked, and then after that, there's nothing in between her being surprised and the reveal of her being a villain that would indicate that she has any negative intent. I do think that a surprise villain can be done very well, and I feel like it's a pretty common trope in all media. But I think that the best way it's done is a way in which the audience, after the reveal, can say, oh, that's why this person was acting that way. I feel like for a surprise villain to be done well, there need to be little sprinklings of odd behavior that can then lead up to it making sense that they were villainous. And to me, Crabgrass just doesn't have that. There's no indication whatsoever up until the moment that she does it that she would have any reason to turn against Bloodgood. And that brings me to the second thing that bothers me about Crabgrass, which is that we literally never learn her motivation. With Hellscream, even though he is doing bad things, you can at least see his misguided logic, right? Like, it doesn't make sense to a person who doesn't want to do harm, but you can see why he thinks that way in his twisted little mind. But Crabgrass doesn't have any reasoning. She's a monster, but she's not a werewolf or a vampire, so it's not like she has a deeply personal stake in the vampire versus werewolf feud. So probably there's nothing like inherent to the feud specifically that is causing her to act the way she does. But Crabgrass is also, like I said, a monster, so it doesn't quite make sense for her to also be acting in the same way that Hellscream is, where she's kind of doing bad things in an attempt to protect humans, because why would she want to protect humans? I just can't believe that Crabgrass is one of two main antagonists, and you never find out why that is the case. To me, that's an enormous oversight in the writing, and it's genuinely probably the worst thing about this movie. So that is finally all of my thoughts on Monster High Fright On. Despite all my complaints, I did still really enjoy this movie. I won't say that it was like the greatest cinematic experience ever, but it was a perfectly fine way to spend a night. And I did really, really enjoy, there was just more meat to this movie that I could critique. Like I said, I have fun critiquing, like that's part of the enjoyment of watching media for me. So the fact that this movie had enough for me to delve in and analyze it was really, really exciting, and I think it made it just leagues above New Cool at School in that way. I would love to hear what your thoughts are on this movie, and also what you thought about my thoughts about it. Next up in the series is going to be Why Do Ghouls Fall in Love, which I'm very excited for because that will be the first 3D animated movie that I've seen, and I was already looking forward to those, so like, I'm very excited. I'm kind of hoping that it at least will live up to the experience that I had with Fright On, but only time will tell, so I guess be excited about that. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day or your night or whatever it might be, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye, guys!